when we look back in this decade, of course, some of us were sitting in smoke-filled rooms a decade or more ago. I see several people in the audience who were definitely there, including my friend David McBride and Paul Mullen, and many others. And we were sitting, if I could just see the first slide, please, we were sitting in a smoke-filled room talking about the forthcoming decade of centenaries. Some of us were in libraries, museums, involved in public history, involved in the community sector, rural community network, all kinds of things. And the idea was to ensure that, we had respectful, we had balance, we had inclusive remembrance of a decade we knew could be quite a stormy one, recalling the events of 1912-14, the Irish Revolution, the Great War, the Partition of Ireland, and, the divisions, historic divisions, which had existed in Ulster and which would be transposed to the new entity of Northern Ireland. And if we could just move on to the next one, please. So just reflecting on this whole period, first of all, we knew it was coming forward. And as I know from, I don't know, many tens of thousands of hours speaking in public forums and making programs about public history, when people in this society are talking about today, they're really talking about yesterday and the past. They're really talking about today and tomorrow. And they're talking about the world in which their grandchildren will live. And I think, the sort of conundrum of Irish history in this region was summed up very well by former President Mary McAleese when she said that in Ireland, we have a common history, but we don't have a common memory. So for one person, 1916 is redolent with memories of the Somme and the heroism of the Ulster Division from the narrow streets of the Shankill Road and the townlands of Mid-Ulster. For someone else, it's the Easter Rising, the blood sacrifice, the execution of Connolly in the chair, and what flowed from that, the movement for an Irish Republic, which has informed republicanism from 1916 on. So that, in many ways, gives us a sense of this. And it was to this end that a number of us actually began to meet in the old community relations offices in Murray Street, way back in the autumn of 2011. I remember several meetings, late 2011, early 2012, chaired by Paul Mullen, when we discussed, the decade we were entering into. And we discussed how would we, create a kind of a framework in which these events could be examined, could be debated, could be discussed in a respectful way. And out of that came the principles, which were very simple. And halfway through the decade, as we approached the more turbulent sort of period of the Easter Rising and Partition, there was a debate as to whether we should change the principles and maybe update them. And we decided to leave them as they were because they had worked very well for this society. Very simple, start from the historical facts, recognize the implications and consequences of what happened, understand their different perceptions, different narratives, and use the events to deepen understanding of the periods and hopefully mutual understanding as well. And that's something I think that has happened across the board. Groups meeting in Omagh, Portadown, West Belfast, East Belfast, Derry, have discussed these matters ad nauseam over the last decade, informed by historians, new research, by plays, by exhibitions, by local councils, some of which have been very groundbreaking. I don't want to cite many, but one that stands out, Belfast City Hall, of course, Newry, but also, of course, Lisburn, which produced a sort of a very, very interesting exhibition on the third burning of Lisburn in 1920. We saw a lot of sectarian violence, and that is now, I think, online, certainly was until recently. And that wouldn't have been possible if it hadn't come out of a background where we had the template of the principles, which were the product of those early days of the round table and that kind of thing. So what were we talking about in this decade? I'm not going to give you the whole history of the decade. We rolled out a series of talks in the spring of 2012 in the Ulster Museum and Stranmillis, where we engaged a sort of a battery of historians, political, social, economic, women's historians, looking at this whole period. And we recorded 26 hours on the Decade of Centenaries, which we made available on the CRC website, in sort of DVDs to schools and local community groups. And that was a resource that would be there for a very, very long time, even though some of us glancing back at it are amazed at how well or unwell we've aged in the meantime. But when we look at this, we're talking about the Home Rule crisis of 1912 to 14, when John Redmond and Joseph Devlin, the Northern nationalist leader pursuing Home Rule within the Empire, were able to exploit, as the DUP were able to exploit a few years ago, a hung parliament at Westminster to persuade a rather weak Liberal government to embrace Home Rule for Ireland as their kind of mantra in these years, resulted in the passing of the third Home Rule Bill into law, signed off by the King in September 1914 for the whole of Ireland. But of course, the pursuit of Home Rule by constitutional means, and remember at this stage, violent nationalism, advanced nationalism was very much in the shadows. You know, you had the Gaelic revival from the 1880s, which was creating that kind of transformation of nationalist politics in what one historian has called the crease in time between, you know, the 1890s and 1916. You almost have to uncrease the page to get the detail and explain the background to 1916. And of course, in the shadows was the small but vibrant and revived Irish Republican Brotherhood, which would involve people like Thomas J. Clarke, Patrick Pearse, the rest, and would, of course, plan their, of course, insurrection during England's difficulty as Ireland's opportunity during the Great War in 1916. The next slide, please. And here we can see the nationalist leaders disappearing, but here we have the unionist leaders. And of course, as I heard Paul Bew say at a conference for loyalists back in the summer where we were speaking, you know, there wouldn't have been a place called Northern Ireland if it hadn't been for the determination of the British Conservative Party, led by a man of strong Ulster Protestant stock, Andrew Bonar Law, to, if you like, oppose Home Rule, because the Tories from 1885 saw Ireland as the touchstone of British politics and saw Home Rule for Ireland as the thin end of the wedge, which would see the loss of the British Empire, the secret of England's greatness, if you like, at this time. And this called forth, of course, James Craig on the right, it's like the elderly Craig here, the captain in the Boer War, the son of a wealthy distiller, Presbyterian, a man of kind of narrow intellect, but determined from his entry into politics in 1906 to save a homeland in northeast Ireland for his own people. The idea of partition in the event of some form of home rule or independence for a nationalist Ireland was driving Craig through his organisation, and he was a supreme organiser. But he lacked that charisma. As the late Jonathan Barden put it, you know, Craig was signally uncharismatic, you might say, hasn't stopped a lot of politicians since. But nonetheless, Edward Carson, the Dublin lawyer, the man of the South, the quintessential Irish unionist, had that sort of star quality. He could play on the masses of Ulster Protestants like a virtuoso in those critical years of 1912 to 1921, when Ulster Unionism was fighting for exclusion from a Dublin Parliament, and even more so after 1916, a Sinn Féin-dominated Republican Parliament. And it was Carson, of course, had his own agenda. He wanted to keep the whole of Ireland, if you like, in the folds of the Union Jack, to see if his own people in Dublin, his father was an architect from that city, his mother's aristocratic Cromwellian settlers in Galway, where he spent his holidays. A man generally of liberal views, supported a Catholic university, but believed Home Rule would be disastrous. Now, it was their partnership. Carson in the end losing out. Carson forcing to plead for his client, the Ulster Unionists, and get the best deal he could for his clients. Not a 32-county Ireland or a 9-county Ulster, but a 6-county entity by 1920 under Unionist control in the north of Ireland. The next slide, please. And it was their actions in arranging for the propagandistic, semi-religious signing of the Covenant of 1912, and especially the calling into existence of the first private army since the late 18th century. UVF formed in 1913 in the shipyards on the estates of friendly landowners, but eventually armed by Britain's soon-to-be mortal enemy, Germany, in the spring of 1914. The Larn gun running, 35,000 German rifles, 3 million rounds of ammunition to oppose the forces of the Crown, it seemed, if they tried to attempt home rule. Now, of course, as one conservative historian said, this strained the bonds of British constitutional history, and it brought Bono Law and the Tory party into a situation that came close to fomenting civil war, because Parliament, as we know, is the alternative to civil war. And in these years, the bitterness of the rhetoric, the strenuousness of the actions imperil, if you like, not just the peace of these islands, but the unity of the United Kingdom. And of course, the UVF was to inspire another movement, because as the historian Michael Laffan told us in those spring lectures a decade ago, Carson was to reignite the Fenian flame of revolutionary nationalism. The next slide, please. And this would see the rise of the Irish volunteers by the end of 1913. And of course, our researches and our public history provoked a whole sort of raft of responses, including people sending us photographs and postcards and diaries that we had never seen as historians. And this one came from the shadow of Clonard in West Belfast, the first gathering of the Irish volunteers, most of them supporting John Redmond and his support for the British war effort in 1914. Many of these men, led by a Dr. Hugh McNally, joining the Crown forces, and many of them joining the Connacht Rangers 6th Battalion from the Falls, matching, of course, the valour of the young UVF men from the Shankill and Mid-Ulster and the Lagan and Donegal. The next slide, please. And of course, what changes everything, of course, is the slow burn of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, that secret underground movement supported by important forces in Irish America, sending Sir Roger Casement on his arms mission to Germany, planning an all-Ireland revolt, which would be narrowed to Dublin as things went wrong. But the execution of Pearse, Connolly and their colleagues in the Stonebreakers' yard at Kilmainham in May 1916 would transform everything. It was the Republican blood sacrifice which would shape the immediate and indeed long-term course of Irish history. Emerging from the ruins of the GPO as a movement called Sinn Féin really means self-reliance rather than our self-alone. The movement actually, its name invented by Carson's nationalist cousin, Mara de Butler, Mary Butler, from the west of Ireland. And of course, that Sinn Féin movement, led by Eamon de Valera, sentenced to death in 1916, would of course sweep the board in nationalist Ireland in 1918 and change the course of Irish history. The next slide, please. Now, conceptualizing all this in the public space was going to be a challenge. And of course, the Round Table were up to challenges. We spent hours in those, as I say, almost smoke-filled rooms in Mary Street, in Shaftesbury Square, people who were dedicated to sort of dealing with this. The Stormont executive was at a dysfunctional phase. A committee of ministers set up to deal with the decade had quickly become mired in the controversies of the time. And so arm's length bodies like CRC and Heritage Lottery and the community sector and Libraries NI stepped into the void. And out of that came a number of interesting things. And one of them was the idea that we came up with of twinning the Rising and the Battle of the Somme, both blood sacrifices in very different ways. We were criticised. I saw one column that said there was no equivalence between these events. They were totally detached, and yet they were united by the bloodshed of the Great War, which, of course, was seen by both sides as a tragedy, but as something which, was concerned with, the freedom of small nations, or, if you like, the search for Irish independence. And that brought me, for example, to East Belfast. Now, you give hostages to fortunes, as we often did in those days. Early 1913, will you give a talk in Templemore Avenue? You can do no problem at all. And I have gone everywhere and always do. Will you do it in August? No problem. And then the flag protests darkened the scene. And that was one night when I turned to my wife and said, "Darling, I'm taking your car." But I did go to Templemore Avenue, and I talked about the Easter Rising and the Somme, and the title had been a provocative one, let's be honest. They wanted a provocative one in the quieter days before the flag protest, from the UVF man at the Easter Rising to Patrick Pearse and the Newtonards, both true. The UVF man, Jim Mitchell from the Mount, who went to Dublin to join the British Army, admittedly picked a bad day, Easter, Saturday 1916, and Patrick Pearse, who visited an Irish language school in Bannahackamore during those long years of his Gaelic League activity. And we opened the whole thing up to talk about St. John Irvine, from Home Ruler to Craig's biographer, to Joseph Campbell, from poet to Republican activist, all from East Belfast. So it showed you what could be done when you linked the events. You took the whole story to every community, regardless, and indeed people from new communities, from Lithuania and from Poland and from other parts of the globe were engaged in these as well, bringing their stories to the public space in Mid-Ulster or in Banbridge, Craigavon and or to Newry, Mourne and Don. Next slide, please. And of course, we looked at the lost opportunities. I remember David Robinson in the City Hall wanting to do the Irish Convention on the very date in which it had visited Belfast during its peregrinations to avert partition between 1917 and 18. This was an assembly which wasn't elected, drawn from the main parties, including the Nationalists, the Ulster Unionists, but excluding Sinn Féin, and which came up with a majority report in which John Redmond and the Southern Unionists tried to avert partition by a low-level Home Rule scheme. It failed in the end, but it's worth remembering. In many ways, a brilliant failure. But remember that night in the City Hall, where we actually had a play, and that became the norm. Plays by Philip All, Halfway House, and set in 1966, recalling the Rising and the Somme, or the one which toured the halls of North Antrim, Orange and Green, Meek and the Major, recalling the sacrifice of John Redmond's brother, Major Willie Redmond, carried down by Private Meek of the Ulster Division and his colleagues on the Western Front in 1917. The next slide, please. And of course, again, photographs emerging as we give talks, in this case in Dungannon and County Tyrone. This is a photograph of Eamon de Valera at Arborough in County Tyrone in 1917. And curiously, he's pictured with the family of Mary Heaney, Seamus Heaney's wife, the Devlins of Arborough, who are very much involved in the fishing industry. It's during a by-election in East Tyrone. And here you have a 36-year-old president of Sinn Féin, ex-1916 commandant Eamon de Valera, with some Republican leading lights of the period pictured with, the parish priest, the local family, the Devlins. And it would never have been discovered if it hadn't been for these public events. And that's the thing. We're looking at the impact of these events in localities. We're looking at the political misfits, orange and green, who emerge in this period. And in the backward glance of history, after a century, we can breathe life into them. We can examine their background, their times, the controversies they existed in and perhaps contributed to themselves. The next slide, please. And here we have, of course, as a background to the Anglo-Irish War, the first Dáil elected in 1919 as a Republican Assembly with its own cabinet headed by de Valera, with its Republican courts, with its Republican loan, having some impact in the nationalist parts of South and West Ulster. But of course, unionism, the men returned from the trenches. The post-war boom is followed very quickly by a post-war slump. Sectarian tensions, which had been on edge in 1914, but where bloodshed had been averted, are revived. And sectarian bloodshed erupts in Belfast, which becomes, in Churchill's phrase, an underworld for the next 2 years. It was cannibalism, he said, in relation to the Weaver Street atrocity of February 1922. Remember last week, one of the worst things had happened in Ireland. A loyalist bomb thrown into a group of Catholic children playing around a lamppost on a moonlit February night. A retaliation for the Battle of Clones, when the IRA had engaged Ulster Specials travelling by train through the new Free State en route to Enniskillen, the border not yet firmly drawn in the minds of the police commander at the time, and yet it erupts in sectarian violence in Belfast, the expulsion of nearly 9,000 Catholics from the work. It becomes a permanent problem, the expelled workers, the imposition of a boycott by the Dáil on Protestant businesses in the north, the Belfast boycott. Some shocking atrocities in this period, of course, involving the Ulster Specials set up to protect and defend the state from the old UVF. And of course, the IRA, highly organised in the north, loyal to Michael Collins throughout the period, the British Army, the declining RIC. Belfast is a battlefield, and the killing fields in north, west and east Belfast, would sort of replicate that violence during our recent troubles. So I think the intensity of this violence and the targeting of women and children, the children of Weaver Street, A lady coming to her own door, "Are you Mrs. So-and-so shot dead?" A year ago today, 100 years ago today, in North Belfast. It still chills the blood, the murder of the Protestant civilians at Altnavay in South Armagh by the IRA on June 22. The next slide, please. And of course, it's at this period the Long Committee is set up, heavily influenced by James Craig, the Partition of Ireland. Would it be 9 counties or 6? The Long Committee decided 9 counties, the historic province, with a larger Catholic minority of about 44-45%, was a more working entity, but Craig rejected it. His actual words, I quote you, he made his views clear to the Long Committee in November 1919. Craig expressed himself against the inclusion of the whole of Ulster in the Northern Parliament and thought 6 counties preferable. The reason given was, the Education Minister of the day recorded, and I quote Craig, "Protestant representation would be strengthened." So here you have the sectarian headcount in drawing a border which will have a large Protestant Unionist majority at a time when religion and politics were synonymous, less so today. The Council of Ireland would become a lost hope of these years, eventually abandoned in 1925 as the Welsh wizard Lord George, does his conjuring trick and establishes Northern Ireland before Sinn Féin enter negotiations. The next slide, please. And of course, so many things we can highlight. But I think the Lisburn pogrom of August 1920, researched by the museum in Lisburn and the subject of a very, very interesting exhibition online. I mean, this was buried in the violence and sectarian controversies of partition, revisited though. Major Fred Crawford, the gunrunner and founder of the Peace Special, said when he visited Lisburn, as it burned, Catholic businesses burned, in that 22nd of August 1920, following the IRA assassination of District Inspector Swansea, he said, it reminded him of a town that the Germans had sacked in France, which he'd seen in 1916. Yet that was airbrushed out, but remembered with so many of the other events, because we have to remember this period, warts and all, if we are to come to terms with it in the public space. The next slide, please. And here we have, of course, the lost counties. We had a conference which the Taoiseach's advisory group that I'm on hosted with Monaghan Museum back in November, 5th of November. And we looked at, partition, its manifold impacts, multifaceted impacts on communities along the border. And of course, one group that suffered intensely were the 80,000 loyalists of Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal, who had backed Carson's campaign against Home Rule, but found themselves marooned in an Irish Free State that never saw Carson reviewing the Ulster volunteers at Ratho in County Donegal in 1914. Great bitterness there in that area between Derry and, of course, Lochswilly, known as the Lagan, planted heavily by Presbyterians in the 17th century, when the UVF was strong, which had their own council, Londonderry No. 2, a unionist council operating from the Guildhall in Derry and catering for that community. They would find themselves a minority on the wrong side of the border, like the people of the nationalists of Fermanagh, Tyrone, the bog side of South Armagh and South Down. The next slide, please. And of course, all of this being examined. I've been to Clonus, I've been to Lisnaskea, I've been throughout the area, I've been to Newry, I've been to Dundalk, where people have looked at the impact of the border. And of course, right through to Brexit and the protocol of today. The next slide, please. And of course, the political misfits, the Reverend Dr. James Hamilton Irwin, the Presbyterian minister of Killeed in County Antrim. Very popular man. He built the schools. He was a powerhouse. He married well, a wealthy wife. His father was a distiller. Lived in a beautiful house on the shores of Lough Neagh, farming 200 acres in the Edwardian years. Donore House, the Fort of Gold. Yet he was secretly an Irish separatist. And in 1920, he toured America with Eamon de Valera in support of an Irish Republic, came back to a rather fractured congregation, but held his own to 1925. Later ended up at Lucan in Dublin, a lifelong friend of Eamon de Valera. Of course, he's the most famous man who ever came out of Killeed, apart from Waddell Cunningham, who wanted a slave company in the 18th century. And of course, I went there, I talked about him, and people told me how, he was known as the doctor. He was a very intelligent man. He'd saved, when a child was ill with the fever, you sent for Dr. Irwin, or a cow was having difficulty calving. And now he kind of walks on water, even though his politics were at a considerable distance from those of his congregation. And of course, his counterpart was Sir Dennis Henry, the Catholic lawyer from Draperstown and South Derry, who represented South Londonderry as a unionist from 1916, elected in an Orange Hall, yet a Catholic who became First Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland, but who stood against the tide in his area, or the Reverend J.B. Armour of Ballymoney, the redoubtable Protestant Home Ruler. Next slide, please. We looked at this in depth, and I remember last year spending many hours with David Robinson and his team in the City Hall, conjecturing how we would mark that historic event. The olive branch to Sinn Féin, as King George V opened the first Northern Ireland Parliament instead. And I forgot to correct the date, David, on the slide. It should be yes, it's correct. Sorry, it was always wrong until now. 22nd of June, 1921. And indeed, that was marked on that day by, radio shows from the City Hall, television from the City Hall, a talk that I gave that went sort of, out on the remotely to the rest of the world, remembering an important event. But the King's words were important. He called on Irishmen to forgive and forget. It was an olive branch to Sinn Féin. It transformed the situation. It ended the War of Independence and led to negotiations and eventually a treaty on the 6th of December 1921. The next slide, please. And Craig visiting Dublin, of course, his 3 meetings with Michael Collins, one with De Valera as part of the Craig Collins Part, which raised hopes, and then they were dashed in a flow of blood in the early months of 1922. Craig on the steps of Dublin City Hall, going in to see Collins. And that's where they broke, their talks became, broke down on the boundary question. And Churchill talked about a return on the border and in Belfast to the hideous bog of reprisals. The next slide, please. And of course, this scene, May Street, you know it well, the corner of Joy Street, May Street, opposite May Street Presbyterian Church, recently closed. 2 specials have been shot dead by the IRA. The specials, of course, Craig's sectarian sort of private army, 32,000 strong, very much in evidence that day in their cage cars. The next slide, please. The reprisal that night, one of a series of reprisals which had been carried out throughout Ireland by the military and the police from 1920 with the support of the British cabinet. This carried out, of course, by specials and members of the RIC under, we believe, a prominent district inspector, the murder of the Catholic McMahon family, non-political, wealthy Catholic family, a prestige target. This is their bodies in the morgue. Something that shocked Churchill into calling Craig and Collins back to London to see if they could arrange a new pact. They did, but again, it would be washed away in that ongoing ocean of blood as Ireland moved towards civil war in the spring of 1922. The next slide, please. And of course, the Altnavay murders, another reprisal by Frank Aiken's IRA in South Armagh, Protestant railway workers, one of them a woman, shot dead in the watches of the night. The next slide, please. And of course, that whole period is ongoing. Zoom has added a new dimension to it. I've done, I don't know how many thousand Zoom talks. I didn't know what a NAT was until they told me to download it 2 years ago. But there we are. And since then, I'm just looking at some of the things we've looked at. Carrickfergus, for the first time, thanks to the local museum and the council, remembered Sean Lester, John Ernest Lester, Protestant Sinn Féiner, friend of Ernest Blythe, Republican propagandist, journalist, went to the League of Nations in the 1920s and became the last Secretary General, facing down Hitler in Danzig, remembered in his native town, a Methodist from Carrickfergus. Or Alex Maskey, who would have been with us today had we had happier circumstances, inviting me to give a talk in the Stormont Senate chamber at the beginning of 2019 to mark the first Dáil, with Robin Newton, the DUP-nominated speaker, along with Sean O'Friel, the Speaker of Dáil. And it was an amazing occasion, cross-community event, MLAs and public. And that, of course, was the gateway for Speaker Maskey's series of Zoom talks, which continued and will now find permanent expression in a permanent historical exhibition at Stormont, which will include the whole period and will very much reflect the principles we drew up all those years ago in 2011. And there you have Mid-Ulster Council's programme. Again, the idea of an intergenerational conference at Benburb 2 years ago, in which we had A-level classes from schools across the divide and the general public looking at the period with a panel of historians, looking at the documents, and of course the Great War. In Armagh, you had the sort of living history elements with, a field camp we visited on the Mall, talks in tents, military historians, political historians, on the one period when Irishmen from the two traditions died, sometimes fighting together in the Great War, but would return to their own divided allegiances. So much has been achieved, so much still to be done. I'm still working for councils who are rolling out this year, looking at the events of 1922, the Battle of Ballick and Pettigo. And one thing I would mention, a lot of my most valuable work has been done with Northern Ireland Screen. And my friend whom I met from this, Anne Donnelly, we have done it for the British-Irish Parliamentary Tier. We've done it for community groups in East and West Belfast and Portadown. We've done it for Libraries NI. We've done it for museums. Really piecing together the historical newsreels of the period, or looking at the civil rights movement. This will be reprised this the Thursday in the Public Record Office at 1 o'clock when there's a Zoom talk on the civil rights marches and the Newry March of 1969. So much has come out. Movies made by John Hume about Derry, with a voiceover by the late Bishop Brian Hannon, then a rector in the city. So much has been done. If I could say one thing that deserves support, if it can be funded, is what Anne has been doing with NI Screen in the community, because people love a movie with a commentary, bringing the history. If you go to Ballick, if you go to Armagh, if you go to Larne, you can look at the local aspects of the bigger picture. There's so much exciting stuff done, courtesy of that first meeting of the round table to discuss the decade a decade ago. Thank you very much.